Essay on the Development of Christian Doctrine by John Henry Newman. Chapter 5, Section 4. Fourth Note. Logical Sequence. Logic is the organization of thought, and as being such, is a security for the faithfulness of intellectual developments, and the necessity of using it is undeniable as far as this, that its rules must not be transgressed. That it is not brought into exercise in every instance of doctrinal development is owing to the varieties of mental constitution, whether in communities or in individuals, with whom great truths or seeming truths are lodged. The question indeed may be asked whether a development can be other in any case than a logical operation. But if by this is meant a conscious reasoning from premises to conclusion, of course the answer must be in the negative. An idea under one or other of its aspects grows in the mind by remaining there. It becomes familiar and distinct, and is viewed in its relations. It leads to other aspects, and these again to others, subtle, recondite, original, according to the character, intellectual and moral, of the recipient. And thus a body of thought is gradually formed without his recognizing what is going on within him. And all this while, or at least from time to time, external circumstances elicit into formal statement the thoughts which are coming into being in the depths of his mind. And soon he has to begin to defend them. And then again a further process must take place of analyzing his statements and ascertaining their dependence one on another. And thus he is led to regard as consequences and to trace to principles what hitherto he has discerned by a moral perception and adopted on sympathy. And logic is brought in to arrange and inculcate what no science was employed in gaining. And so, in the same way, such intellectual processes as are carried on silently and spontaneously in the mind of a party or school, of necessity come to light at a later date, and are recognized, and their issues are scientifically arranged. And then, logic has the further function of propagation. Analogy, the nature of the case, antecedent probability, application of principles, congruity, expedience, being some of the methods of proof by which the development is continued from mind to mind and established in the faith of the community. Yet even then the analysis is not made on a principle, or with any view to its whole course and finished results. Each argument is brought for an immediate purpose. Minds develop step by step, without looking behind them or anticipating their goal, and without either intention or promise of forming a system. Afterwards, however, this logical character which the whole wears becomes a test that the process has been a true development, not a perversion or corruption, from its evident naturalness, and in some cases from the gravity, distinction, precision, and majesty of its advance, and the harmony of its proportions, like the tall growth and graceful branching and rich foliage of some vegetable production. The process of development, thus capable of a logical expression, has sometimes been invidiously spoken of as rationalism, and contrasted with faith. But though a particular doctrine or opinion which is subjected to development may happen to be rationalistic, and as is the original, such are its results. And though we may develop erroneously, that is, reason incorrectly, yet the developing itself as little deserves that imputation, in any case, as an inquiry into an historical fact, which we do not thereby make, but ascertain. For instance, whether or not St. Mark wrote his Gospel with St. Matthew before him, or whether Solomon brought his merchandise from Tartessus or some Indian port. Rationalism is the exercise of reason instead of faith in matters of faith. But one does not see how it can be faith to adopt the premises and unbelief to accept the conclusion. At the same time, it may be granted that the spontaneous process which goes on within the mind itself is higher and choicer than that which is logical. For the latter, being scientific, is common property, and can be taken and made use of by minds who are personally strangers, in any true sense, both to the ideas in question and to their development. Thus, the holy apostles would, without words, know all the truths concerning the high doctrines of theology, which controversialists after them have piously and charitably reduced to formulae, and developed through argument. Thus, St. Justin or St. Irenaeus might be without any digested ideas of purgatory or original sin, yet have an intense feeling which they had not defined or located, both of the fault of our first nature and the responsibilities of our nature regenerate. Thus St. Antony said to the philosophers who came to mock him, "He whose mind is in health does not need letters." And St. Ignatius Loyola, while yet an unlearned neophyte, was favored with transcendent perceptions of the Holy Trinity during his penance at Manresa. Thus St. Athanasius himself is more powerful in statement and exposition than in proof, while in Bellarmine we find the whole series of doctrines carefully drawn out, duly adjusted with one another, and exactly analyzed one by one. The history of empires and of public men supplies so many instances of logical development in the field of politics that it is needless to do more than refer to one of them. It is illustrated by the words of Jeroboam, "Now shall this kingdom return to the house of David, if this people go up to do sacrifice in the house of the Lord at Jerusalem." Wherefore the king took counsel, and made 2 calves of gold, and said unto them, Behold thy gods, O Israel. Idolatry was a duty of kingcraft with the schismatical kingdom. A specimen of logical development is afforded us in the history of Lutheranism, as it has of late years been drawn out by various English writers. Luther started on a double basis, his dogmatic principle being contradicted by his right of private judgment, and his sacramental by his theory of justification. The sacramental element never showed signs of life, but on his death that which he represented in his own person as a teacher, the dogmatic, gained the ascendancy, and every expression of his upon controverted points became a norm for the party, which, at all times the largest, was at last coextensive with the Church itself. This almost idolatrous veneration was perhaps increased by the selection of declarations of faith, of which the substance on the whole was his, for the symbolical books of his Church. Next a reaction took place. Private judgment was restored to the supremacy. Calixtus put reason, and Spener, the so-called religion of the heart, in the place of dogmatic correctness. Pietism, for the time, died away, but rationalism developed in Wolff, who professed to prove all the orthodox doctrines, by a process of reasoning, from premises level with the reason. It was soon found that the instrument which Wolf had used for orthodoxy could as plausibly be used against it. In his hands it had proved the creed. In the hands of Semler, Ernesti, and others, it disproved the authority of Scripture. What was religion to be made to consist in now? A sort of philosophical pietism followed, or rather, Spener's pietism and the original theory of justification were analyzed more thoroughly, and issued in various theories of pantheism, which from the first was at the bottom of Luther's doctrine and personal character. And this appears to be the state of Lutheranism at present, whether we view it in the philosophy of Kant, in the open infidelity of Strauss, or in the religious professions of the new Evangelical Church of Prussia. Applying this instance to the subject which it has been here brought to illustrate, I should say that the equable and orderly march and natural succession of views by which the creed of Luther has been changed into the infidel or heretical philosophy of his present representatives is a proof that that change is no perversion or corruption, but a faithful development of the original idea. This is but one of the instances with which the history of the Church supplies us. The fortunes of a theological school are made, in a later generation, the measure of the teaching of its founder. The great Origen, after his many labors, died in peace. His immediate pupils were saints and rulers in the Church. He has the praise of St. Athanasius, St. Basil, and St. Gregory Nazianzen, and furnishes materials to St. Ambrose and St. Hilary. Yet as time proceeded, a definite heterodoxy was the growing result of his theology, and at length, 300 years after his death, he was condemned, and, as has been generally been considered, in an ecumenical council. Diodorus of Tarsus, says Tillemont, died at an advanced age in the peace of the Church, honored by the praises of the greatest saints and crowned with a glory which, having ever attended him through life, followed him after his death. Yet St. Cyril of Alexandria considers him and Theodore of Mopsuestia the true authors of Nestorianism, and he was placed in the event by the Nestorians among their saints. Theodore himself was condemned after his death by the same council which is said to have condemned Origen, and is justly considered the chief rationalizing doctor of antiquity. Yet he was in the highest repute in his day, and the Eastern Synod complains, as quoted by Facundus, that blessed Theodore, who died so happily, who was so eminent a teacher for 45 years, and overthrew every heresy, and in his lifetime experienced no imputation from the orthodox, now, after his death so long ago, after his many conflicts, after his 10,000 books composed in refutation of errors, after his approval in the sight of priests, emperors, and people, runs the risk of receiving the reward of heretics and of being called their chief. There is a certain continuous advance and determinate path which belong to the history of a doctrine, policy, or institution, and which impress upon the common sense of mankind that what it ultimately becomes is the issue of what it was at first. This sentiment is expressed in the proverb, not limited to Latin, exitus acta probat, and is sanctioned by divine wisdom. When warning us against false prophets, it says, "Ye shall know them by their fruits." A doctrine, then, professed in its mature years by a philosophy or religion, is likely to be a true development, not a corruption, in proportion as it seems to be the logical issue of its original teaching. End of section 4 of chapter 5.